Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Coming Up Next. Thanks for tuning in, thanks for the download or for the stream. If you're not already subscribed, you can find links to subscribe at comingupnext.com.au, where you'll also find the entire archive, all 137 previous episodes, conversations with some of the world's top creatives, like my guests this week, Lee Matthews and Neil Triffett, the producer and the writer-director of Emo The Musical, which is just an extraordinary piece of Australian cinema. If you haven't seen it, if you're not familiar with the film, you can find it on iTunes, on Google Play. It's available on all of those online platforms. You should do yourself a favour. Before you listen to this episode, hit pause, make sure that you've subscribed to the show. Then, while you're in iTunes, go to the movies section and buy or rent Emo The Musical. Then come back and hit play again on this interview. We get into their career. We get into the inspiration for this. We talk about, really towing the line, being adventurous and being daring in what they do put into the film. And we talk about the usual silliness, philosophy, and life. And if iTunes isn't your thing, you can find other links to the other platforms at emothemusical.com, as well as lots of other information about the film itself. So while you've got that browser open, here is my chat with Lee Matthews and Neil Triffett. Very much for having me in your home, Lee.
Pleasure, thank you.
I really appreciate you inviting me, and both you and Neil agreeing to stumble through a ramble with me about the work that you guys have done. You guys have worked together for a while now.
We met at VCA in 2010, and I produced Neil's graduating film then, so we've been working ever since.
Right, and Neil, you were doing an undergrad, and Lee, you were doing a postgrad, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so Lee, just to sort of, I guess, recap, what had you been doing up to doing this postgrad in producing?
Prior to producing, I've done about a decade's worth of arts and festivals management, primarily focused on the Midsummer Festival, which is in Melbourne, and another decade prior to that in international trade.
Okay, wow, that's quite a diverse...
I'm old, yes.
Diverse background. So what was it that, I guess, thrust you into going back to school and studying filmmaking?
Producing screen content is vastly different, but similar, if that makes sense, to producing art and theatre, art events and theatre. And having kids, being a stay-at-home dad, slowly going crazy, watching a whole lot of kids' content, gave me a few ideas for some TV shows that I wanted to produce.
Yeah.
Or create. And I quickly realised that I needed to understand the language, I needed to understand the industry, and that's when I went back to VCA and did a postgrad in producing to get a handle on how things work. Since graduating, I haven't done any kids' content since, but right. That was the motivation.
Yeah. What were some of the premises of kids' content that you were...
Oh, I had an amazing concept about telling the time. It was fascinating. Riveting.
Yeah. And Neil, what was your pathway, I guess, to the VCA?
I got in really young, so I graduated. I was spending a year doing university down in Tasmania, which is where I'm from. And before then, I'd done quite a bunch of odd jobs around the place. And I kind of just wanted to escape from Tasmania for a little bit.
That's fair enough.
It's a lovely place, but it's very quiet. Culturally, it's very quiet. So I applied to a whole bunch of arts places around the country, and VCA took me. I didn't actually know what VCA was at the time, so I kind of got pretty lucky in that way. But from there, I kind of worked out it was something I was good at. It was something I enjoyed doing. And it just kind of continued to rumble along.
Right. You guys have just spent the last few years creating and releasing this amazing feature film, Neil, your first feature film, Emo The Musical, which this year got a cinema release and now a SVOD and DVD release, which is pretty incredible, especially given, you know, the kind of timeline that you turned it around in. It was, what, 2 years from the beginning of production until it premiered at the Melbourne Film Festival, and you know, just the whole, I guess, story and process of the film is remarkable. I am interested to know, though, before kind of going into that, if you guys sort of remember when you first thought about becoming, you know, working in the film industry or working in the entertainment industry, what your first kind of memory of show business is.
I think for me, it's like I've never really decided to be in film. It's kind of something that has continued to happen to the point whereas now I think after having just made a feature film, I get to decide whether this is what I want to do. So I'm currently in the process now of kind of going, is this the industry? I've had some success at it. I think I'm good at it, but is this something that I want to do? I think artists should be continually asking themselves that. Art is something I've always been interested in. I went to a very small school and there were not many opportunities to do art, so every opportunity I absolutely took. So it was very early on, and I can't quite remember. And in some ways, it might have been in opposition to the other kids to go, well, you guys don't like art, that's what I'm going to like. That's going to be my thing. And I think I've kind of followed that into adulthood, which is, you know, really healthy, I'm sure.
As a 10-year-old, I was interested in acting. So we lived in Craigieburn, which is a good hours north of Melbourne, and I made my mother drive me into acting classes in the middle of the city. So I've always been attracted to this form of entertainment, but I quite quickly realised that I wasn't an actor and I couldn't really act. And then, you know, I gave that, not that it was a dream at the age of 10, but, you know, gave up that desire. Got on with my life, as I said, you know, a decade in international trade. And then through the gay and lesbian community and through Midsummer Festival, I had an opportunity to embed myself within the arts more so than I ever have. And, you know, everything sort of springboarded from there.
I also did a quick stint as an actor. I tried to get into NIDA, and 1 year they loved me, and the next year they said no. So I was still trying to get into NIDA the year that I got into VCA, and I was just not. I just got progressively worse as time went by. I thought I might have been good to start with. Just I acted too much, probably.
I've seen your acting gigs. You did okay.
I now do I do totally straight face, where I don't bother acting. I do this stage show where I play this man who is obsessed with Tony Abbott, like literally almost masturbating obsessed with Tony Abbott. And it's nice to kind of get on stage and not act and just kind of go, hey. And people get confused and they get upset, and I find that's what I find fun these days, less than the actual acting.
I remember when you created that show, and I was so worried that people would think that was truly were your politics.
They did think that. They dealt. We dealt. We healed.
It's kind of Andy Kaufman-esque.
Yeah, it was a little bit like that. I don't feel the need necessarily to do that anymore. I saw that Jim Carrey doco. It's bloody brilliant. Makes you not want to be an artist anymore. But yeah, it's great.
Yeah, I loved it. I was watching it going, I have to watch this again already. I hadn't even finished watching it. It was brilliant. I mean, I love Man on the Moon. I thought that the doco was almost better than the film.
Yeah, I think the movie's amazing, and you kind of go, it's worth it. Well, you kind of go, I think it's worth it that he went through that pain. I think one of the big takeaways for me was that, you know, we kind of treat art like an industry. And it's like, if he just did that and then went off and did something else for 10 years, he'd be fine. He'd be a well-adjusted human being. But there's the expectation that Jim Carrey has to be an industry and he has to then go make something else. And it's like, he just couldn't have kept going.
Yeah. It was interesting because it wasn't really a documentary that was like about the behind the scenes of Man on the Moon. I mean, it was, but that was more like the kind of vehicle for a documentary about Jim Carrey and identity in a kind of bigger sense. Yeah,
it was like a documentary inside Jim Carrey's head, and I think it was actually really effective in that way. And yeah, I think you do get out of it going, I don't know if this is whether art is something that's necessarily healthy to do in a long-term way. Like, I'm sure when we were cavemen, I don't reckon we would have been we wouldn't have had a permanent storyteller. We would have taken it in turns, and when people had something to say, they'd go out and they'd work on producing that piece of work and bring it to people. Whereas now it's an industry. It's like you're forced to kind of go, all right, what's next? And you're like, oh, I don't have anything next. And it's like, no, go out and give us something next. And you have to mine deeper and deeper into really places that can be quite harmful, I think, just so you can continue to make a living out of it. Because you can't just rock up and say, I'm going to be a filmmaker now anymore anyway. And say, I want to be a filmmaker, I've got this story, let me tell it. It's like, well, what other 10 stories have you told first? And it's just really, it's completely unsustainable, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. How significant do you think it is, both of you, that, and perhaps this is something maybe that is kind of ingrained in film school, the idea that, you know, your stories, or the stories that you tell, have to come from your own kind of experiences and your own sense of truth, or whatever you want to call it?
I'm much more commercial than Neil. Neil has a commercial sensibility. He's absolutely driven by the art that he creates, but I'm much more focused on the commercial. So I do understand that it is an entertainment industry, and you're creating stories that a very specific audience will want to immerse themselves in. So I don't believe the story needs to come from a personal experience. It certainly needs authenticity and specificity. However, it can be imagined. It should be imagined, and it should be larger than anybody's single life.
I remember at VCA at film school, like one of the very first classes we had was screenwriting, and the lecturer made us come up with horrible stories that had happened to us in our past. And kind of the inference, they never said it directly, but the inference was, this is where you're going to get your stories from, your traumatic history. And I remember everybody went out and they came up with the most horrific things that they could think of. There was kind of like a level of one-upmanship. I'm a kid from the Port Arthur massacre, and my family had to go through that, and I pulled it out in front of a class that I was not ready to discuss that in front of. So there was just the feeling straight away that this is where you get your stories from. And I think, like, on the one hand, I think that's true. You do have to kind of have a level of connection to a story. You've got to know what it is you want to say within that story, because stories need shapes and they need to have a point to them. But at the same time, I think that you need to be able to... The danger of that is we can have very limited stories. Like, film school kids aren't a diverse population. Forget sexuality and race. It's like just talking about like class. It's like there are no people who are lower class within a film school. Like they just aren't allowed in. They just don't have the they don't have the resources to support their way through film school. Which means, I don't know, if you're coming in. The danger of working from that process is you've got to have a huge amount of empathy to be able to tell those stories. Otherwise, you just end up with this blancmange of kind of like middle-class rubbish, which is the danger of working that way.
Yeah. What sort of films did you guys find, I guess, inspired or motivated you, like when you were going to or at film school?
I went through a Dardon Brothers period, which is ridiculous. We made Emo the Musical, and here we are talking about the Dardon Brothers. The Dardon Brothers does not influence emo at all. But it was kind of nice to go, these could be really simple stories that are... they're working class stories. They're about things that really matter, and they're about human needs that are really basic human needs. And I've always found that kind of form of cinema to be really interesting. But at the same time, it's like I'm obsessed with Alexander Payne, and I continually go back to Election as a movie that is about human pain, but it's also about massive global intellectual ideas, and it's in a high school movie. So I find that kind of cinema fascinating too.
We both share an adoration for Master Payne. But I love to pull out that my favourite, and it is quite genuine, my favourite film of all time is Grease. And you pull that out in amongst a group of film school wankers, and it kind of drops to the floor quite quickly.
Yeah. So, what was the first thing that you guys collaborated on was Neil's graduating film? Before kind of pulling that out of the bag, Neil, do you remember the first film that you made while you were at film school? What that experience was like?
The very first one was they kind of build you up incrementally to making bigger films. So there were a lot of smaller exercises that we worked on. The year before we made a film together, I made a film called Sara, which was inspired by a big issue article about this person who went around cleaning up after dead people, because dead people die, and if they don't have relatives, they're kind of just that the government has to go and fill in the gap and clean up their houses and all that jazz. So I made a film that was kind of almost a narrated drama, kind of like Jane Campion's Passionless Moments, where it's just a narration about these people who have just died and the processes that have gone through their heads and what happens to the people who are left behind. And it's kind of funny, but it was abstract. It was really quite an abstract movie.
Very dark.
Yeah, dark, but also quite funny. I think like the voiceover is quite affectionate towards the people who are dead, but doesn't sentimentalize them either.
Look, it's still one of my favorite short films. It's a really wonderful film.
So, Lee liked it so much he came up to me in the cafeteria, and really, basically, all you need to get me on side is just butter my ego. Right. So he just came in. I don't know who told you that, but it worked. He came in and said, like, I'm sitting around with all the other film school kids, and you're all competing because you all think you're a genius. And this producer walked in and says, Neil, your film was amazing. And I'm like, oh, all the other kids turn and look at me. I'm like, this guy's got me. I'll do anything.
Totally calculated.
Right? Yeah, of course.
No, it was quite genuine.
Yeah. What did you find to be the part of the process that you kind of relished?
I really love working with actors. The problem-solving things are the most beautiful things, where you kind of get in a room with somebody else and say, all right, here's going to be the challenges here, and this is how we're going to work through them. So I love, like, especially with that film, it was a film where actors kind of didn't have an arc in their scenes. Like, they didn't rock up, and there wasn't a point where they didn't get what they wanted, or they didn't go in with a huge motivation and then they had that motivation thwarted, so they had to think about how to overcome that. There was none of that. It was like they were just doing little things like buttoning up things. So it was kind of building up a mental backstory for them around that. So just kind of going to the actor and going, this is odd, this is an unusual thing for you to be doing, how can we facilitate this to help you do it? And we did some amazingly fun things. I've never done things as fun as this before. I took Stephanie Moreau, who was the actress in it. She and I went and hung out into some cemeteries for a while. Another guy was playing an asylum seeker, so we went to the asylum seeker, what is it, the one that's the Immigration Museum, which is on Flinders Street. So we went there. And yeah, I've never worked like that again since, basically because of resources and lack of resources. But it was wonderful, and I think the actors really appreciated it. So at least when we got on set, we liked each other, which was really nice. But yeah, I really value that part of the process a lot. So
Lee's buttered you up. He's got you on side, and you guys decide. Well, I guess you guys decide to collaborate together on your graduating film. What was the process like for you guys of working together on that short?
I think it was one of the first times Neil got to pitch stories to someone to see if they would work with him. So we sat down and went through a range of ideas, and Shoplifting is the film that we ended up making together and the one that resonated with me most, but it wasn't all my decision.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was partly wanting to give a collaborator a lot of options, so I gave him several scripts to read, but also not quite knowing what I wanted to do myself, which I think is something I still struggle with. But yeah, it was kind of going through, these are ideas that I'm interested in. We both focused on shoplifting, which is kind of, it's a working class story that's a little bit funny too. It's about a man who's teaching his son how to shoplift in an era when they're introducing those security panels in the front of department stores for the first time. And his older son is now stealing things off the internet. He's just doing straight credit card fraud. So it's kind of like it's the times are changing, and who is going to be able to control what the youngest son learns, and who has the legacy in the family. So it was something that, it's a nice idea in that there's a bit of humanity in it, but it's also a little bit odd and unusual. Like, we don't normally hang around shoplifters, I don't think. So no. I think we both like that part of the idea.
And it is, you undersell it. It is funny.
Yeah.
It is.
Well, Lee, just as a sidebar, what was it like to go back to school, to go back to tertiary education?
Yeah, look, I found it exhilarating. It's lucky enough I was able to spend a year, full-time studying. Interestingly, my colleagues in the postgrad course were all around my age, so it was a real coming together of people from a hugely different walks of life, and sharing one common interest and some common goals, and thoroughly enjoyed it.
So you made shoplifting And then
it turned out okay.
it turned out okay.
Yeah, it turned out to be a really good film. So we actually got some festival. We really got some festival traction. We've tried Melbourne. I've made 15 short films and tried Melbourne Festival every time, and didn't get in with Shoplifting. We didn't get in with Emo the Musical, the short version either.
Even after Berlin, we didn't get into Myth with Emo.
Yeah, but there's a payoff for that with the feature, but we traveled. We Shoplifting played around the world, and gave us some confidence, I think.
It also gave us a lot of understanding, like just working out how the film festivals work, because it's a totally different scale to when you have a feature film. But to kind of go, well, the process of entering film festivals is trial by error. Like, everyone talks about the strategies that they have, but I think mainly Lee would have to go through the process where it's like, you've just got to bloody submit to everything. You see those films that have got 50 or 60 film festivals to their credit, and you go, oh, well, their film must be amazing. And sometimes you just go, no, they've got people behind the scenes who are entering into so many festivals. Like, I know with Emo, we had money from Screen Australia, so we spent over $2,000 submitting money into Emo into film festivals. Yeah, which is just enormous.
Yeah.
But you've just got to do it, and you've got to have the money, so you've got to be, you can't be poor. Awful, but true.
Yeah. What were some of the challenges, I guess, in making Shoplifting, if there were any, in the production process?
The big one, the enormous one, was the fact that it's completely set in department stores, like entirely. And
Right.
to the point where it's like, in the last few days, I'm like, oh, do we set this in an antique store? What else can we find? There's not many department stores that are independently run. You go and talk to West Farmers, and they're just no cigar. They don't give a flying damn about whether or not they want you. Or whether you can film in their store. So yeah, we had to really make things work around kind of smaller department stores. I had a lot of trust issues during that process, just because Lee was not able to produce the goods until very late in the game. And looking back, it's like, we were lucky to have done it at all. But it was a hard process. How did it go?
Look, we went to every major shopping centre, and we would either, as Neil said, we'd either get blanket no, very straightforward no, or they'd take some time to say no, and that was a challenge. And that's a good segue into casting as well, where you're putting it out there, you're hoping for a yes, everything's on hold waiting, you get the no, and then you've got to start again. And we did that a number of times before finally finding the locations that really did suit the film well. But that was the 11th hour, and as Neil was saying, there was a point where he's like, okay, look, I'll rewrite it. I'll set it somewhere completely different, set it in a completely different location. And I wasn't quite ready to admit defeat, but it took until the 11th hour.
And we shot in Dimmy's in Richmond before it was closed down. So we've got a little bit of Melbourne history in our movie, which I think is beautiful.
That's very cool.
The lady who was in charge of it, she had our request on her desk for 5 weeks. Right. And we would continually ring. And I think they just weren't responding because they thought, well, it's easy, we don't care. So they called us up the day before, and they said, yeah, sure, come in. And we're like, we've been dying here. But for them, it was not an issue at all. But it was for us.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, you got it over the line in the end.
Totally, yes. And it was crucial that we did, or the film would have made sense if we weren't in department stores.
Yeah, sure. And so, I guess from the festival circuit that you guys did, you were able to kind of leverage the profile, the respect that you kind of create for yourself as artists. Lee, you went on to co-produce the Heckler and Our Little Secret as well, documentary.
Yep.
What was the process of going into that sort of stuff like?
It's interesting to leave film school, realize how competitive the industry is, try like hell to punch out in any way you can, get some festival success through Shoplifting, but that didn't necessarily translate into additional opportunities for us. And I'm very much an opportunist, so I actually I was just out there looking for a range of ways to try and get our concepts produced. Our Little Secret is a documentary that screened on the ABC, and that was my first broadcast credit. There was an opportunity for directors under the age of 30 to make their first longer form show, and it came from a concept. It its main character is a friend of ours, Chaz Fisher, who we went to VCA with. So we got our little secret up with the ABC, and that allowed me to present myself to Screen Australia and to Film Victoria as a film producer with a qualifying credit. The Heckler is a body swap comedy that friends of mine, Ben Plaza and Steve Mitchell, wrote and directed, and I came on board to assist them through the process. They also pretty much self-produced, and that was what people perceive as low budget, which really means no budget. A few $1,000s in cash and a whole lot of reinvested salaries that will never be repaid. And that was an amazing opportunity for me to experience the feature film process, but also learn what not to do, or what I thought at that stage, what I shouldn't do, in greenlighting a project without industry support. So when we made Emo the short film, and we were lucky enough to get completion funds from Screen Australia, and then finally get into Berlin, there was an opportunity to go knock on Screen Australia's door, with all of that behind me, to then try and get a feature version of Emo up, and to tick boxes. And for me, that was a state, a federal agency, a state agency, and coming back to MIF to secure MIF Premier film funds, to really give the project ticks of approval, so that the industry would recognise it as inverted commas a proper film.
Yeah, right. And Neil, you went off and worked a bit in the industry. I saw you did worked as an assistant director on Partisan.
I was an assistant director's attachment, so I was there on the helpful days when they needed me around. I did a whole bunch of things when I graduated. So mainly I went off. I was doing this really strange play while I was at film school, where they got all these people of different faiths together to produce this project, and I went in as an atheist and said, I'm an atheist, what can I do? And we made this beautiful play that was performed at 45 downstairs, and from there they kind of found out I was in film, so I went into doing documenting work for different theatre projects, and that was amazing work. So I travelled around Victoria speaking to people who they were dying, and they had kids with disabilities, and it used to be that kids with disabilities, or especially kids with Down syndrome, would die before parents, and then suddenly the parents the kids are living so long. So it was like a huge challenge for the government and for these parents as to what they did with their kids for the first time. So I don't know. I got to do that. I worked with Platform Youth Theatre, who worked with disadvantaged youths and a whole bunch of different people, and it was absolutely amazing work. I tapped into some production work. It's kind of hard to tap into production work in a lot of ways, especially if it's like not something you're totally sure you want to be doing. Like I was getting so fulfilled by my community arts work that I was like, I don't know if I want to go and be a production runner. But I did. I went off and I did a production running gig on Cliffy, which was an ABC telly movie. Also produced by Nigel Odell, who was the producing lecturer at VCA the year that we were there. And I don't know, I was applying for things. So I know Lee and I were we were keeping in touch, and we were applying for projects like the ABC Open Shot docos, and just my ideas were just not getting up. And I remember applying for, actually I probably shouldn't say the funding body, it wasn't Screen Oz, but it was another funding body, with a script concept that I had. And it was like one of the few things that was open to new and emerging writers. And it was just one of those moments where you realise like it's just really important who they have assessing, because I got comments back that said you should throw it in. Like this is abominable. You should not be a screenwriter.
Right.
And it was awful. And I was on Cliffy at the time, and I just made a lot of money. And I'm like, well, I'm going to have to fight that person, and I'm not going to be able to write to them and say you're a jerk. But I had the money, and we made Emo the short off that. And from there, we got the completion funds, and it was kind of gangbusters after Emo started to go so well. But yeah, there was that point where it's like, if I didn't have the money come into my bank account at that particular time, I might have thrown it in and just stuck around and did community arts.
Yeah, right. And you guys self-funded the short, didn't you?
Yeah, we did.
How important was it in that moment for you guys to kind of put your money where your mouth is, so to speak?
Well, that was the first time Lee had put his money where his mouth was for that project. So that was like, shoplifting wasn't that expensive, but it was covered by me. It was, VCA is different, and there's like the director kind of comes in and says, "This is my movie, you help me or you get out." And it's like, so of course the producers aren't going to give money to a narcissistic screwball like that.
Yeah.
But it was something we knew we wanted to do a project together. Lee and I had always said, well, what's the next one going to be? And we always knew there was going to be something fun, and we thought it was going to be a musical from the get-go. So I think Lee was more invested in it from an emotional perspective. He wanted it to be good as well, and we both wanted to like get some runs on the board with a funding body. So yeah, we both put our money in for that one.
Yeah, and look, it's investing in Neil as much as my own career. I think Neil is right. When you go through film school, you're volunteering on a whole range of projects, and I made some 15. I was involved in some 15 shorts, and I always said I volunteer my time, but not my money. You leave the film school environment, and it was all about both getting our careers going. So, of course, it meant investing our own dollars. There weren't any opportunities for government support with short films around 2012, 2013. So completion funds was the only opportunity to attract some form of government funding and therefore the government tick of approval. And at the time, there was a 15-minute limit on short films, and our film was running at 20. And I kind of thought, well, I'm really proud of this film. I don't think we can get it down to 15 minutes. They'll probably reject it because they will realise that we couldn't get it down to 15 minutes. But at least they'll see our work, and we would have hit their radar. And we were lucky enough to be the only ones that year to be offered completion funds, which meant we had to bloody well get it down to 15 minutes.
We didn't take the idea seriously at all. I left the country because I thought it was such a unlikelihood of getting emo up into the completion funds. So Lee gave me a call when I was on a boat, I think in Mumbai, and it's like, hey, by the way, we have money. And I'm like, oh, this is good.
And you have to cut a song.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Because we had to remove a song. So a lot of it was just kind of fancy editing. So we had Sasha Dillon Bell, who's a great editor, come on and just kind of trim the crap out of it. But they also wanted to change the ending around, and it was with the feature film. It's like, I think Screen Oz was probably less hands off with story than they were with the short film. They were kind of like, this is what we think you should do with the short film, and I think to some extent they were right, or rather they said, here's our problem with it. So the ending of the short film, basically for those playing at home, it's about an emo boy and a Christian girl who fall in love. Their friends don't like each other. And in the final scene, his friends have all been expelled because they've done horrible things to the Christians. So now the Christians see him as like free game. It's like they're going to claim him as one of theirs. And he turns around and says no. But there was kind of a lot of ambiguity about why he said no, and exactly what happened in her head towards the end of the movie. So they just said, this is ambiguous. We want you to make it less ambiguous. And that was kind of the only note we did. We had limited access to actors. We had limited amount of money, and we had to go, all right, so if we've got this actor, how do we reshoot this scene a year later when they're young people and they've grown up a year, their hair's all different, we've got to book out the exact same space, and we just had to write an ending that would somehow work amongst that.
Yeah, right.
And it did.
Yeah, I think it did. Yeah.
And for those playing at home, they can see the short films we've been speaking about actually on your website, can't they?
Yeah, emothemusical.com. There's a good plug.
Yeah. And shoplifting is also on the YouTube channel too. Yeah, Sarah. It's all there.
It's all there. So you got the completion funding, you're submitting it to festivals around the world, Emo, the short film, and you get into Berlin.
Yeah, Berlin, and our life changed. It's one of those things that everyone aspires to get into a top-tier festival. We'd actually tried the year before with the longer version, and we were shortlisted but didn't make it. And they'll only allow you to apply again with significant changes, which we were confident in. But it did mean that we had to wait. So, when you look at the top tier, you look at Cannes, Venice, Berlin, Sundance, and Toronto. They all play at different times of the year, and we held out on Berlin, which meant holding back on some of those others, but got in, and life changed.
It was one of those odd things as well, where we got a no before we got a yes. I think they said no first, and yes. Lee is good in that he badgers people until they say yes. No, that's not how we got in, but we were confused as to why it was a no then a yes, and then when we got there was this beautiful girl in the office, and it's like, oh, I've forgotten her name. I'm a jerk. But she said we were just singing the songs in the office for so long after we saw the film and it had been rejected that, I don't know, they must have had a spot come up and they said, well, let's schedule it just to keep the people in the office happy almost. And then, of course, to be kind of a slightly commercial film in the middle of an art house festival meant that we really stood out. Like, I think a dog was murdered by a young boy in the film preceding Emo in the screening that we were in.
Right.
So it's like when Emo came on, everyone's like, oh, thanks that this has been scheduled. And I think the jury, the young jury, they got it, and they were appreciative that there was something lighter in there as well, and we got the special mention, and I think it was because of that, the fact that we were an odd film programmed in the schedule.
So did you guys went to Berlin, I assume?
We did, and we were supported by, I think, Film Victoria, and then they housed us the festival themselves when we were there.
That's very cool.
It's a great festival.
And Screen Australia. Yeah, both.
Oh, cool. What was the experience like of going to that?
It's so nice to be like in another country where people, like, they flock around that film festival, and people value art so strongly, and it's such a huge part of their culture there, which isn't necessarily the case in Australia. So it's just beautiful to be somewhere where you're incredibly appreciated, like not just a little bit or tolerated. You are held up as being something that is really useful to society. So I don't know. I think it's always a big ego boost, because we did Berlin earlier in the year too, and in some ways it's a little bit deceptive, because you leave going, oh, I am a worthwhile human being. What I do does matter. And then the moment you leave the festival, it's like, oh no, it doesn't. Everyone still hates us. But
Bubbles popped.
It's this beautiful fictional world where anything is possible.
Yeah, I agree. Also, it was my first international film market as well, so it was eye-opening. The commerciality of it all was extremely eye-opening as well.
What do you feel like you learned, I guess, from that?
Just how competitive and how much crap is produced each year. It's also, when you look at how much America dominates international cinema, and I learnt a bit about what you need to do to stand out. And when you compare that to a reputation that Australia had in the years prior to this, that we were making kind of dreary, navel-gazing kind of shows, it was a real opportunity. It was a real wake-up call to make sure that what we were developing was capitally entertaining.
So from here, you have the credibility to go on and make the feature-length version of Emo, and as was mentioned earlier, from production to premiere, it was 2 years or under 2 years, which is phenomenal considering that most Australian films take 7 years-ish to be made from conception to completion. What was the process like of actually, did you have the script already written? Did you have the songs already written? What was the creative process like?
So when we got the completion funds, we started to be a little bit cheeky, because this was the first time we had spoken to a funding body, and they're so important in this country. So we said, all right, we've got a dialogue. They like this idea. Let's see if we can start scripting. So I think I started scripting 6 months before we went to Berlin, not knowing we were going to get into Berlin. And in some ways, if the film festivals circuit hadn't been so good for us, it would have been not worth our while. But yeah, I started scripting then. Lee supported that. We didn't have any support from a script editor or such at that stage.
We went across to Berlin with a feature film in our back pocket. In fact, we were editing it on the plane on the way over, and we didn't end up showing anybody that script. But it gave me a confidence when I was taking those meetings, that I knew that we had something that we had a short film as a proof of concept, and one that had got into Berlin, and then we had a feature script that deserved to be made into a feature film. So both of those assets really gave me a confidence to take those meetings and promise a script in due course. We then applied to Screen Australia for development funding, and we pretty much page one rewrote that original script, so that the script we took to Berlin probably hasn't seen by anyone other than Joe Dillon.
But there were a lot of the gags are still in there. There's some of the songs, because I would write the songs as I went along with the script, so a lot of the songs survived their way into the movie. But yeah, it was a total rewrite. But it was really comforting to kind of go, not just do we have an idea, this idea is translatable. Because one of the first things the people would say when we would bring it in was like, look, we love the short film, but I don't think there's 90 minutes in this. And being able to say, no, there is. So it's like things like the Rockestead, which was introduced into the movie to give it that beautiful 90-minute arc. That was introduced in the very first draft. So in the very first drafts, we knew this is how we kind of carry this movie. And that idea stuck all the way through.
Yeah. Did you come from a background in like musical theatre or writing music, or because it's somewhat unusual to be making musicals full stop, but to make it as your first feature film, and one that's really good as well. What was your background in music like?
It's an odd one. So, as I said, I'm from a country area, so my mother paid for me to get musical tuition. In fact, I think it was my mother's idea. She just said, this kid's creative, let's just throw some piano lessons at him. And I was taught by the local piano teacher, who wasn't necessarily the most technically proficient person in the world. A beautiful woman. But then I got to college and everyone realized that, this kid can read perfectly. He can't play for crap. So I was like, I think that the music teacher would literally bully me until I left the class. It's like, he was like, we don't want to bring down the college's reputation by putting this kid through exams. So I think I stuck it out to do one exam round, but then the next year I'm like, oh, this is crap. I'm not going to bother doing this. And I still like playing piano and I still like doing music. So I started to kind of write angry songs about things that were crap in life, and then they kind of became slightly funnier. So I think they began as therapy, and then they kind of became a bit of an entertainment source.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of toe this subversive line really well. I didn't quite know what to expect when I watched the film. In the sense that, am I going to be watching like a kind of popcorn musical, or am I going to be watching a kind of Trey Parker, Matt Stone, like complete envelope pushing satire? But it kind of towed the subversive line without being too crass, but it knew it certainly knows when to go there, and also when to be poignant and sweet. It seems to me that this kind of darker sense of humor is a kind of thread throughout your work, from what I'm hearing and from what I've seen as well. How important is it for you, in the context of Australian films, where we spoke before about having a reputation for being quite dreary? How important is it for you to kind of try and differentiate yourself from that and make things that are, I suppose, comedically driven?
I think, like, purely just from my own point of view, I can be quite a depressing human being. Like, I'm not the most fun person in the room. So if I don't make comedies, I feel like my work can get really dour and depressing. I've since tried to write a few dramas since finishing Emo, and they just come out as really, really bleak. I've just finished one that had a rape dungeon sequence in it, and I'm like, oh, geez, no one wants to watch that movie. But I think, like, the darker, cynical side of it is me. So I think I understand that the shape of the movie is really important, and that's what people latch onto, and they want to see something that they have seen before. So they're okay with the fact that it's a Romeo and Juliet story. It's like, no one hates that story. People love seeing it. And the fact that it's an emo and a Christian is like this new thing that's slightly refreshing about it. But it's also something that explodes the idea a little bit. Because this emo is not going to end up happy by the end of the movie. This emo does not want to be happy by the end of the movie. So purely by making those little changes, you can kind of go, this format has a limit. So I like to think that we kind of explore the limit that the format has. And sometimes I think people, especially critics, have watched it and said, oh, this is just cliche, and this is like, it pulls out all the tropes in the book. And it's like, well, of course it does. It's like, we are kind of trying to explode those tropes and say, how do these emos and people who aren't happy about these tropes fit within these tropes? And I think that's the part that's me. And the cynical lyrics, I think, is the best part, the most refined part of that tone. But I think it's all the way throughout the movie.
Yeah, there were certainly parts where I was sort of, I guess, caught off guard or surprised by where it would go, which is refreshing. But at the same time, there was that sense of familiarity about the characters or the story that was being told. What were some of the challenges that you guys faced on a kind of day-to-day basis, or when you were in production for this film?
We had enough of a budget to cover the costs for what we needed. We had a 6-week shoot, which was punctuated by Christmas and New Year. So we had a week a week and a bit break in between 2 lots of 3 weeks. So we were lucky in that regard, luckier than so many other filmmakers. But it was, it is an ambitious film, and one that I think quite proudly we pulled off. But it meant that Neil was under a lot of pressure with a large ensemble cast, many actors, big set pieces within the film. And it was our first fully funded film, so all the usual challenges that would come with that.
Yeah, I think it was just in some ways it's amazing that we were funded and went into production so quickly, but I think there were some repercussions for that, and for me I think it happened almost a little bit too quickly. And I think especially as a first-time filmmaker, you're not able to say no, and you're not able to say, no, I need 6 more months, or I can't go into production if we don't have the music recorded first. So there were some things that it's like, I just should have pulled the brakes and said, no, I need 3 or 4 more weeks if we're going to do this properly. And as a first-time filmmaker, the film wouldn't have got done if I had said no. I think there would have been a period where we just couldn't have made it. But at the same time, being able to say no is a strength that you don't know how to do in your first film, and I think it's an invaluable thing to know.
Is there anything that you would do? Is that something that you would do differently if you had your time over again?
Yeah, I think because we shot just before Christmas. This is me and Lee working through therapy on the couch here. So we shot just before Christmas, and there was always the option we could have shot in January. We would have lost some of our cast if we had done that, but there might have been other casts that would have been available. So I don't know, I would have needed those 3 weeks. There was a point where it's like I said, I absolutely need to have recorded these songs before we go into pre-production, or I can't do it. Yeah. And then it turned out that we couldn't do it, and I'm like, I didn't pull on the brakes and say, no, I can't do it. Like I said I couldn't do it, and I was right. I can't do it. But I kind of buried my head in the sand and said, no, I can do it. It's like, no, you've got to stick by your guns and say, no, I can't do it. I can't.
Yeah. And look, we were naive. It was our first major film. We produced a 20-song double CD soundtrack in the middle of pre-production. Ridiculous. If we said that to anyone in the lead-up, I'm sure they would have said, you've got to be kidding. But, when you haven't done it before and done it at that level, you don't really know.
And we're in this interesting period in the industry where budgets are getting smaller and smaller, and things that are being expected are getting bigger and bigger. And I think people are kind of losing sight of what you should say yes to and what you should say no to, because projects will only get funded if they're big and brave these days. But with the budget shrinking, how do you pull that off? So I don't know, I think the line is also getting blurry as to what you should or shouldn't tolerate as an artist, or as just someone who practically has to rock up on set every day and keep sane. I don't know whether other productions would also do music while they were doing pre-production. It's baffling. I don't know how you could do it, but there are more musicals doing it. You look at, I'm watching Crazy Ex-Girlfriend at the moment, and I just wonder, how are they? It's bloody great. Yeah. And I wonder, how are they pulling this off? Like, they would have to do all of those songs before they started doing anything. Otherwise, that cast must be killing themselves every day to rock up on set after doing the studio recording beforehand, and it'd just be enormous.
But also the resources behind it, though. So they've got lyricists and composers who are working behind the scenes, so that when the lead actor, who is a writer on the show and does sing the majority of the songs, probably steps into quite a safe space. It's completely prepared. Yeah. So it's part of the process. We didn't have that process in place. We didn't have our lead actor until a few weeks out of pre-production. And as Neil said, many of our actors were only available for a certain amount of time. So we didn't have even in hindsight, where we would have made a more informed decision to separate song recording with pre-production, we didn't have the actors. The actors still had to record their songs. So had to be in town, and therefore, how long can you afford to pay them to be in town, and are they available?
You guys have had a great amount of success with the projects that you've done to date. Speaking before about Berlin and this and Emo the Musical, where that's gone. How do you guys kind of where would your idea of success have begun when you started the process of making Emo the Musical, and how would you view its success or it as a success now?
I think we're still really deeply in the middle of it at the moment. I mean, I've stepped away and stopped doing work on it for a while, but Lee's only just recently slowed down a little bit on the publicity of it, because we've just done our iTunes release. But yeah, we're going to be on demand late in February, and I think that's the point where the people that we want to see it, which is young girls, like that's where they're going to see it, is going to be there. So I don't like beforehand. It was kind of reaching that audience, and I think it's still the dream at the moment. It's interesting because I have always thought of this as a project by project industry. So at the moment, it is still just getting this project to reach its audience. I don't think we've quite done it yet, but I think there's still hope for us.
It's interesting how I've evolved my definition of success. I think coming into this, it was about commercial viability. It was making sure that I created content that was seen by the widest audience possible, and that's been redefined by me in a number of ways over the years. I define Emo's success. Emo is successful in that it's a great film. It's a really solid story. It's engaging. It's entertaining. It delivers messages and politics that I believe in a fun way, in an accessible way. It just hasn't been seen by the audience that we wanted it to. Our theatrical release was not a success, and we're now online and finding that audience. Interestingly, the short has been seen by 600, nearly 700,000 people. And you would hope that they would find the feature and celebrate the feature as much as they celebrate the short online. And I reckon that will come in due course, but we just haven't hit it yet.
What just out of curiosity, what has been the process for you of getting it onto these streaming services?
The feature film was pretty much a self-release in partnership with Jonathan Page from Bonsai Films. We were aiming at getting it into a number of suburban cinemas, and we weren't able to do that. That was our downfall in regards to our theatrical. But the industry recognised it was a good film. When we played at MEF in 2016, we had an industry screening, and people raved about it. So when it came to home entertainment, we were able to talk to NBC Universal, we talked to Roadshow, we talked to Mad Men, we talked to Umbrella. And we ended up partnering with Madman for the home entertainment release. So that means that it is on iTunes, it is on Google Play, on Vimeo on Demand, on YouTube Movies, and it is quite accessible.
That's awesome. Well, Neil and Lee, thank you both very much for having a ramble with me. I really appreciate you inviting me into your home and chatting about your lives and your careers. I finish all of my podcasts with the same question. Lee's looking away. Not looking forward to this one.
I know the question. It was what makes it silly, and I had thought of an answer previously, and I've forgotten what it was. Other than the fact that I'm just not a very silly person, which is embarrassing.
Maybe I should ask Neil. Neil, what makes Lee silly?
What makes Lee silly? Oh, geez, no. I feel like that would be rude. Yeah, I don't want to. Look, you want the list? I'll tell you privately. Yeah. It's like, no, he's great. He's just terrific.
Well, what makes you silly?
I think what makes me silly is that I work too bloody hard, and I don't give myself enough credit for that work. And I look at other people all the time and look at what they're doing and think they're so much more successful and amazing. And I think the whole industry is quite silly because, we push ourselves too bloody hard sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where you don't really... Like, I can relate to that entirely, feel like when I do actually step back and go, wait a minute, I pretty much do nothing but work. But then when you're in the flow of it, you're not really thinking about it. You're not really aware of what you're doing. You're just kind of... just getting on with it and doing it, and you're looking at all these other people and what they're doing and feeling like, wow, they're doing so much more, or I need to keep doing more, or whatever that is.
And you're almost waiting for somebody to come up and say, you can relax, you've done a good job, take a break. And no one will ever do that. In some ways, it's such a lonely industry. And even those people who are looking at who are quite successful, they're waiting for someone to come pat them on the shoulder and say, you're all right, go home, you've had it, you've done good today. Doesn't happen.
Maybe one day.
One day, no, I can't imagine it. You've got to do it yourself.
Yeah. Well done, Al.
Well done, Al.
Thanks, guys.